Your work is a reflection of yourself. Many entrepreneurs face this where they're like, I don't want to let go of certain things, but you are limited by your own time and your own effort and your own energy. A chief of staff needs to be a really good storyteller. They have to have a very strong narrative and present that narrative to the executive. Why would I spend time coaching somebody else? I'm looking for a coach. One, the best way to learn something is to teach to somebody else. People who are more junior than your career bring a different perspective. I think sometimes people go very formally into asking somebody to be a mentor, but oftentimes there are people who are already around you. Not doing something also needs to be time blocked. Taking a walk, having lunch, sleeping. When you don't get enough sleep, you make decisions as if you were drunk. AI is not going to replace a chief of staff, but a chief of staff who knows how to use AI will replace a chief of staff. Learning how you take feedback is such a critical part of the self-awareness journey, because if you don't know how, it doesn't matter how much feedback you get, you're never going to internalize it.
So Clara, thanks for coming on our podcast. Could you tell us about the defining moment as chief of staff at Hugging Face that led you to launch Ask a Chief of Staff?
Absolutely. So I will say that my journey into a chief of staff role was a little bit windy, which I think a lot of chiefs of staff will tell you as well. But the kind of extra exciting layer of my chief of staff journey is that I started in office in New York in February of 2020. So right before the entire country went into lockdown, and New York obviously was one of the most strict places that was locking down. And so I thought I was going to have an in-person relationship with my CEO and learn from each other, get onboarded, and be able to work very closely together. But instead, that was cut short, and we went from in-person in office for about a month to fully remote. So during that time, I actually took it upon myself to reach out to hundreds of other chiefs of staff on LinkedIn, asking if I could buy them a virtual coffee so that I could learn from their knowledge and ask them, how are you navigating this pandemic? How are you getting out of leases that you signed? How are you managing to get everyone the equipment that they need in order to have an at-home setup? What are you doing for the mental wellness and health of your employees? All of these things that none of us had ever anticipated was going to be part of the job description, and we were all tackling for the very first time. And that's where I would say the seeds of chief of staff community really started to blossom, was that I knew I was dealing with this challenge. I knew many of the chiefs of staff that I was talking to were also feeling very lost and confused on how to navigate some of these huge obstacles that we had never faced before. And I figured, there had to be a better way than me individually reaching out to each one of these people to gather their knowledge and then synthesize it for myself. Was there a way that we could bring together this knowledge of the commons and create a space where chiefs of staff could come together and share all of these experiences and learn from each other? So that's the short version. I went from actually becoming a chief of staff to now a founder and entrepreneur is a longer story that I'm sure we'll get into more later on in this podcast.
What surprised you most, or what was something that surprised you in having those early discussions with chiefs of staff during that transitional period into the pandemic?
Some of the surprising things were how much we are given and the latitude in which we are expected to execute on a lot of these things with very, I would say, less oversight than many other roles, but also how much we're expected to just figure it out. I think that's the biggest thing, is that you think that you can prepare yourself for this role, but honestly, who could have predicted a pandemic? There are a lot of things that change in the economic landscape that you can't predict, and you are expected to figure it out. And so, you're often the only person with this title, especially if you're at an early stage startup or a smaller company. There's nobody else really like you at your company, so your peers are not necessarily within your own organization. And there's no one really telling you this is the one right way to do it. There is no right way to do this job. And so that was really surprising to me, because I thought I would have a bit of a clearer expectation or mandate of what it meant to be successful in this role. But at the end of the day, it's all about supporting your principal, the executive that you work with, and freeing them up to work in their zone of genius. And that can look very different across different organizations.
I wonder, especially considering that was your experience where you started in February 2020, just bad timing in that sense, and your experience through that, but then also we've come out the other side of the pandemic. Work looks very different than it did beforehand. Considering your unique view of how you might see this, What do you think about the working from home versus working in the office debate? Where do you sit on that argument?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've heard a lot of arguments for both sides. As somebody who works remotely and runs a remote company, obviously I have a bias towards that, but that's not to say that in person is not valuable in its own right. So the question that I would always give to people who are considering whether or not they want to work from home or work for a company that's more in office is what are the cultural aspects of the company or the organization that you're working for that you value the most, right? Do you value in person because you like building a social circle around the people that you work with, or is it okay for you to be a little bit more detached and really have that true, work life separation, at least in terms of office versus home? um, do you prefer to be in a space where there are certain days where you come in, right? A lot of people are doing hybrid, and I think hybrid is always a really interesting way to create that kind of both in person and being able to be flexible with workspace, and give people the option, right, of coming in or having that space and dedicated space. I know for many parents during the pandemic, it was particularly difficult because you no longer had childcare and you were the childcare expert while also trying to do a job. And so having, again, separation of office versus home life is very important for people. So ultimately, I think it depends on your stage of life and what your personal preferences are. And you need to find companies that are going to support that particular point in your lifestyle. I don't think there's a right or wrong. As much as I know people like to say remote is better or in office is better or hybrid is better, it comes down to personal preference and also kind of the values of the company.
Makes sense, and that lining up, because I think one of the big issues is if people during the pandemic either started a role or moved their role to being fully online, that some would have hated, some would have loved. The mandate to come back to work is then a misalignment, at least from the experience for what, a year, 18 months, I guess, that most of us were at home, and kind of finding that realignment again and finding where you fit, having changed the routine, and companies needing to figure that out the other side as well.
Absolutely. I do think that the pandemic did give individuals a lot of clarity on what it is that they value, right? From their work life balance or work life integration, however you want to describe it. And I've worked in hybrid, if not fully remote environments for a majority of my career. And it's the learning curve to learn how to adapt to that as well, right? Having a designated workspace or working from home doesn't mean just working from bed, which I think a lot of people have the misconception of, like, just because you work from home, you can really work from like your pajamas. But there are, I think, habits and practices that make a more effective remote employee versus, just opening up the floodgates and saying like now everybody can work from home. So yeah, there's a lot to consider. I don't, again, these are very nuanced questions and depends a lot on individuals. And so I hesitate to say, one is better than the other. At the end of the day, I think it's a self reflection, and also your work is a reflection of yourself as well, right? Where do you want to show up? What companies are you working for? How do they represent you? That all goes into consideration as well.
What's one unexpected hurdle you faced when starting Ask a Chief of Staff, and how did you navigate it?
Yeah, one unexpected hurdle, and I think many entrepreneurs they tackle this often, is that in the beginning, the company only grows as fast as you're working, right? Like there is a correlation between kind of hours put in and output, at least in the start, especially if you're a solopreneur like myself, where, I was literally controlling every aspect of the business. But at some point, you do hit a wall, right? And I think like there have been studies that show, past 40 hours a week, like the amount of output you're actually getting is starting to decrease if it is even increasing at all, right? There can be detrimental effects, overworking people, burnout, all of that. And so one of the hurdles that I had to face early on was, okay, now how do I delegate parts of this business to somebody else, especially somebody that has not been there with me since the very beginning and may not have the same context that I do. And I think many entrepreneurs face this where they're like, I don't want to let go of certain things. Like if I give this part of the business up or delegate this to somebody else, it's not going to be as effective as if I was doing it myself. But you are limited by your own time and your own effort and your own energy. And so understanding that about 6 months in led me to the decision to hire my EA, who has been an integral part of the business ever since. I always tell her constantly, if it weren't for her, I would not be able to run my business the way that I do. But it was a hard struggle. It was something that I really had to grapple with. Like, do I want to spend money here? Do I want to spend capital and time to train somebody to do things that may not be 100% of where I am, but if I can even get this person to 80%, that will free up my time to go work on other parts of the business, grow a separate revenue stream, work on partnerships that only I can work on. And I think this ties back nicely into my business, is that I encourage CEOs to hire chiefs of staff for themselves, right? Or even build up an office of the CEO where you have an EA and a chief of staff, because it's not about just surrounding yourself with people and delegating work to them. It's about freeing up your time as an executive to work in your zone of genius. Why are you the only person who can be at the front of this business? And what are other parts that can be done at, let's say, an 80% of what you would be doing, but still accomplish the longer term goals? And switching from short term to long term thinking was definitely a hurdle that I had to grapple with.
You mentioned the support that you have from your EA, and I see that more and more with solopreneurs and entrepreneurs having a good EA. And do you have any advice for how people can go about finding the right fit for an EA, and how did you go about finding yours?
Yeah, so thankfully, I knew a reputable agency that I hired my EA through. Um, I think that you are looking for some key things. One, a very strong communicator, right? My EA and I work in very different time zones, and we work a lot async on Slack together. And so having strong written communication was a must for anybody that I work with. And now the rest of my team is also fully remote. We don't work in the same time zones or cities. So having really strong written communication was a non-negotiable. The other thing was, the ability to follow instructions. And I would say this is, very specific to an EA. If you hire somebody who's a chief of staff, obviously, like, you will want them to be more strategic minded, or, have a different skill set. But EA specific, like, are you able to follow instructions? And if the instructions are unclear, are you asking the right questions, as opposed to just trying to do like a version of what you're interpreting those things to be? And I found that, my EA was able to do all of those things, and then in addition add to the playbook that I had written her, right? So again, we work async. So I'm sending her a lot of looms where I'm clicking around on my screen, I'm giving her instructions on how to do something. And to me, it makes perfect sense because I have all of the context. But when you're teaching it to somebody else, that's where you realize there are kind of key concepts that they don't have the context of, or maybe like you're clicking something and they have no idea how to even get into that platform. And so what I really saw my EA take a lot of initiative on was that she would translate a lot of those video looms into actual written playbooks and go through them herself, so that if and when there's a chance that she's going to be out, or I needed to hire somebody else, or there are even parts of her job that we start delegating somewhere else, we're able to take those playbooks and use them with the next person. So, ability to follow instructions, caveated with the ability to ask good questions when the instructions are unclear, and clear communication.
So would you say that's also in the rapid growth that you've had of building, I think, over 400 chief of staffs in your community? Would you say your growth happened at a more exponential rate once you started to delegate and once you started to have that support?
Well, I can say that I didn't even consider launching a community portion of my business until I hired an EA. So in that sense, that correlation, if you will, of even having a community offering in the first place was very much because I was able to delegate, inbox management, scheduling, a lot of administrative stuff to my EA, to then free up my time to even dream up a new revenue stream for my business. When we first started Ask a Chief of Staff, we were solely focused on recruiting, on the matchmaking process between finding great chiefs of staff for CEOs or other executives. The community portion came because I was able to take a step back from kind of the nitty gritty, in the weeds portion of working on recruiting, because I had administrative support, that I could even think of, okay, here's another way that we can involve the audience that we are looking to serve. So in that way, I would definitely say, like, the influence of hiring an EA led to a very significant part of what our business is now.
You mentioned how we as business owners are limited by a few variables, energy being one of them. You're obviously a high performer. Where do you derive your energy? Where do you get charged?
Yeah, I love this question because I think the kind of follow up always is, are you an extrovert or an introvert, right? And like, how do you derive your energy? Where does it come from? For me, cop out answers, I feel like I'm a bit of an ambivert, but the reality is that you get energy from the things that excite you. What are the things that like really get you up in the morning, and what are the problems you're excited to solve, right? Answering emails is like not something that I would say that I derive a lot of joy from, but is a necessity of running your business. And so being able to offload some of those tasks so that I can focus on meeting our members in person. I love going to these happy hours that we are able to throw, these networking events. I love that we get to partner with really great organizations like Notion and Industrious. And those are the things that bring me energy and really kind of keep me going throughout the day, is when I have conversations with some of our really great partners and our community members, and really kind of see the impact that we make on their careers. I guess more tactically, I mean, sleep is like the biggest thing that I think many entrepreneurs are like, I can go without sleep, and eventually burn yourself, or burn yourself out, or burn the candle at both ends. And I actually resisted reading the book by Matthew Walker, Why We Sleep, for a very long time, because I knew it was going to tell me all the things that were wrong with my sleep schedule that I in concept knew, but like did not have the scientific facts to back up. And one of the things that really stood out to me was that when you don't get enough sleep, you make decisions as well as if you were drunk. And I think that hit home so hard for me. Like, I'm sure we can all have an experience where, we were making poor decisions, but to have your decisions equated to basically if you were drunk and making those same decisions, like, hit home so hard. And I really try to get the at least 8, if not 9 hours of sleep per day now, to make sure I'm not in those situations. And I think, like, retroactively looking back, I can definitely see, like, yep, when you don't get enough sleep, your mind is not fully there. Like, your brain needs time to metabolize and rest and re-energize itself so that you can make good decisions for your life, your work, your business, whatever it might be.
It's kind of counterintuitive, but that art of knowing when to let go, and because the work will always be there, progress is happening faster and faster. So there's this frenetic pace, this hum, this buzz that you feel, I need to do more in order to just remain relevant, let alone pull ahead. But you're getting gradually less and less effective the longer that you hold on. So then knowing kind of when to let go watch a movie, go to sleep, go do something completely unrelated and recharge, because most of your thinking is actually done in the unconscious anyway, it seems. And then come back and you can bang out like 8 hours worth of work in an hour. So, but it's hard to like find that. Sounds like you found your equilibrium there.
It's I would like to think that I have it figured out. There are definitely still late nights, or nights that I don't get enough rest. And so I think it's a constant balance of things, which I'm sure many entrepreneurs can relate to. It's give and take. But if you have your kind of outstanding goal, or what your ideal looks like, that's something that you can consistently work towards.
It's funny you say about the not having enough sleep, meaning that you make decisions as if you're drunk. I think I'm more likely to be well rested, but David's less likely to be drunk than I am. So between us, we can probably make good decisions. So I want to actually pivot to the matchmaking process that you do. What are some of the things that you've learned there? What are some of the critical elements that you take into account when doing that process?
Yeah. So for matchmaking, I mean, the term matchmaking comes from, dating, right? You really kind of think about it in a sense of like you're trying to find love, or you're trying to optimize for the potential of love between two people. And I like to take that analogy into what we do for CEOs as well, right? Like, you could be looking for a partner, I could be looking for a partner, but we may be looking for very different things and characteristics, and the things that we value in another person can be very different. Doesn't mean that one partner is better than the other. It just means one is a better fit. And so that's kind of the approach that we come to the table with when we talk to CEOs, that we really try to understand what is their zone of genius, what brings them energy, and what makes them excited to work on their business. And then what are the parts of the business that are still important but don't necessarily need to be done by them. And so I like to Eisenhower matrix it out. And I have to give credit to another serial entrepreneur named Michael Girdley, who I saw this chart, and basically kind of separates the quadrants of what an executive does into 4 different areas. One, what is kind of simple, and what is complex. That's one axis. And then the other axis is delegable and non-delegable, right? And so simple and delegable would fall under more of an EA's bucket, right? Like very tactical, like you could follow these instructions, you do it, it's going to get checked off. Then you have your complex, but also delegable. And that's where a chief of staff really comes in. And that's the bucket that we really kind of look at and figure out what are the skill sets that we would need in a chief of staff to fill that bucket. And that is often a part that needs to be taken off an executive's plate. Ideally, then you have your simple and non-delegable. A lot of the times I find that this is kind of personal stuff that an executive may hold on to because they like, oh, well, it feels like I shouldn't delegate this kind of stuff. I'll give an example. I thought that ordering a cake for my sister's birthday, simple task, but non-delegable because it's personal, right? I was like, if I don't order this cake, my sister's going to feel like I copped out. Not true. She doesn't care where the cake comes from or like who ordered it as long as it's there and it's the specifications of whatever she wanted. And so ideally for an executive, you take that simple and non-delegable and try to figure out how to delegate that too, whether that's between an EA or a chief of staff, and usually it's a combination. Then the last quadrant that leaves your executive with is your complex and non-delegable, and that's where they should be spending 90% of their time, as much time as possible, because that is why they are the founder or executive or CEO of this company. That is the bucket that nobody else can work on in order for this business to be successful. So if we use that framework, again, complex and delegable is where the chief of staff really comes in. That's where we extract the skill sets that are necessary in order to find a great candidate to match with this executive.
Nice. I like that way of thinking about it because it's not probably a lot of people think about it on just one of those spectrums. This is too complex for me to delegate, or this is simple, I can delegate it, or maybe I don't want to delegate it. But by thinking, okay, there are things that fit into that bucket, and then I need to find the right person to fill that. Coming at it from the chief of staff's perspective, what would you say are the qualities or the experiences or some elements that you think they need to have to stand out to really be able to fill that bucket for a lot of executives?
At the end of the day, I do think that a chief of staff needs to be a really good storyteller. They have to have a very strong narrative and present that narrative to the executive. I think there's a lot of literature out there that says, chiefs of staff are generalists, right? They can do a lot of different things. And in theory, that is true. But every business has a certain set of challenges that they are currently facing, and the executive is trying to solve for those types of things. And so I always tell people as a chief of staff, you're going to most likely have a windy career. You're going to have a lot of titles that like don't make sense or they don't feel very linear. And it's because you've worked on a variety of different things throughout the business to get to where you are considering a chief of staff role. Now, when you present that to an executive, you don't want to tell them I can do anything, because an executive has a specific set of problems that they're looking to fill or fix. The analogy I can give you is if you have a broken arm and you go to a doctor, you don't want the doctor to tell you, oh, I can run a blood panel for you and I can do your annual checkup, right? You have a broken arm. You want them to fix it. Even if they can do all of those things, what you want to hear is, I know how to set broken arms. I've done this 10, 15 times. Here are all the different ways I can do it and all the success stories I have, even though they do have this arsenal of other skill sets in their back pocket. And that is how I really try to coach chiefs of staff to bring their best foot forward, is to understand what are the problems in the business. And there are certain things that you won't be able to know until you work with that executive, but there are certain things that you can glean, right, from the news that's happening. Maybe there's certain industries that are being regulated. Maybe, at this kind of stage of company, they're going through a scaling issue or they need to hire or whatever it is. So you need to figure out what are those specific top 3, top 5 problems that the company is facing, and then dig through your work history and figure out when have I worked on these kinds of problems before, and present those to the executive that you'd like to be a chief of staff for. So I really try to caution people against cold applications, because the breadth of things that you are trying to cover on your resume is going to be many, many pages long because you've done so much. But how are you going to actually know what skill sets are kind of most important, at least for your first 30, 60, 90 days? You can only really understand that by understanding the context of the company, talking to people who work at the company, and understanding that executive that you want to potentially work for.
Given your experience scaling communities like On Deck and now Ask a Chief of Staff, what's your number one piece of advice to anyone looking to grow a professional network?
So I actually had a really great conversation with somebody yesterday, and she said that when people join communities, there's three things that they're really looking to grow in. One is a professional network, right? How can I increase the number of people that are relevant to me? Number two is your net worth. So how can I talk to people and increase the amount of money I'm making, or, how can I earn money from this? And then the last piece is education, is how can I benefit by learning something from this group of people? And so if you're able to get two out of those three things in a professional community, right? I think the networking part is kind of a given, but the knowledge or like the earning potential piece, those two, if you're able to optimize for either one of those as well, the value of your professional community then becomes much higher and is much more enticing. I think a lot of people think, oh, if I just get people in a room, they can talk to each other and they'll figure it out and something will happen. But in reality, people join communities because they haven't been able to do that. They've been in rooms and they haven't gotten a great relationship out of them, or like they feel very lost. And so we really try to empower people with frameworks so that they can check off one of those three things in that bucket. So one of the things that we try to recommend to all of our members when they join is, when you come into this community, I don't expect you to talk to all 450 other people. That would be crazy for me to have you do that and have a full-time job as a chief of staff. It would just be simply impossible. But what we want you to do is find three people, and we're going to call these people your own personal board of advisors. So in these three people, this is what I want you to look for. One, a mentor. So somebody who's ahead of you in their career. Maybe they've been a chief of staff before and they've moved on, or maybe they've been a chief of staff longer than you, or maybe they're just older than you and they're just more senior in their career. That person is going to be able to help you forecast what comes next in your career. Then you want to find a peer, someone who's sort of going to be a benchmark for comparison for you. And this is what I was trying to do when I was reaching out to those hundreds of chiefs of staff on LinkedIn, right? I was trying to find people who were kind of in similar stages of companies or similar stages of careers and be like, okay, what are you doing that I'm not doing? What are things that you have learned that I haven't learned yet? And vice versa. What are things that I can teach you? And we can kind of benchmark ourselves and make sure, okay, we're growing at the same pace. Or if I'm not, how do I get there? And vice versa. So second person in your kind of board of advisors is a peer. Then the last person, I think this is the one that surprises people the most, is that I tell people to try and find a mentee, somebody who's more junior than you, somebody who's maybe only 3 or 6 months into the role. And when people hear that, they ask, why? Like, why would I spend time coaching somebody else? I'm looking for a coach. Two reasons. One, the best way to learn something is to teach it to somebody else. It's how we crystallize information. When you teach it to someone else, you have a deeper understanding of what it is that you actually are teaching to someone else, and you learn it better. Then the second piece is, people who are more junior than your career bring a different perspective. They are going to be able to challenge a lot of the things that you've held as longstanding beliefs, because they are fresh to the scene and they bring a pair of fresh eyes. And so in that essence, there have been companies that actually do reverse mentoring, right? So instead of pairing, an older person with a younger person, having that older person guide this person, they actually use the younger person to push the older person and challenge their ways of thinking. And it actually leads to more innovation down the line. And so we recommend that you actually find a mentee as well, so that you think you're going to be passing on your knowledge, but a lot of the times you're actually going to learn a lot from the interaction as well. So we give people that framework, and by finding that framework, you're going to check off hopefully two of those boxes, and maybe the third one, right? Professional network, you're going to have that group. Then your educational knowledge piece, you're going to have that too. And with that benchmark, you're going to be able to increase your net worth as well. You can advocate for a salary range if you're supposed to be somewhere else and find parity, or maybe you find that you have been grossly overpaid and you decide it's time for me to take on another position that is going to be more reflective of what my salary is. So I know that was a mouthful, but hopefully that gives a framework in terms of how I look at professional community building.
That's very well said. And I arrived at a very similar conclusion, not as well articulated as you put it, but I realized I needed a mentor. And then I realized it's actually a good idea to maybe have two, because there's so many different, there's so many blind spots. You don't know what you don't know. And there's different perspectives, even on, like, you and I could look at a picture and have two different takeaways from the same exact picture. And then what would we communicate to that to someone else? That would also perhaps differ. And then I had a mentee through the Board of Trade here in Vancouver, and I was learning so much more from her than I felt I was imparting. And I was like, how is this possible? And it's like, now I was like telling everyone, you need a mentee, you need a mentor, and like, and peers, of course. So yeah, I fully agree with that. How did you find like your personal mentor now and your mentee?
Yeah, I would say for my mentors, I'm not even sure if some of them know that they are my mentors. I actually had a conversation with one of them today, and she was surprised. She said, "Wow, thank you so much for coming to me with your challenge. Like, I'm so honored that you would think to call me, or I was on your short list." And to me, I thought it was a no-brainer. I was like, "I look up to you so much. I admire you. I of course value your opinion, and that's the only reason why I would call you if, I thought that you were going to give me a great advice." Um, and so, I think sometimes people go very formally into asking somebody to be a mentor, but oftentimes there are people who are already around you. And I always encourage people to like think about whose opinions you value, and sometimes people can play multiple roles in your lives. Like some of my peers, or my contemporaries, I would consider mentors and vice versa. For mentees, I run this massive community now, and I have a lot of folks who are more junior in their careers that I'm able to impart my knowledge into. One platform that I was using a little while ago was a platform called 20. I'm not sure if they're still active, but essentially it was a mentor mentee platform for people in their 30s to mentor folks in their 20s. And I thought that was a really great avenue for me to be able to work with folks, and talk to them who were kind of in the stages that I was, 10 years ago, where I was trying to figure things out. And honestly, similar to you, David, I'm like, I feel like I'm getting more out of this conversation than I'm giving to you. These 20 something year olds are so impressive and so ambitious. And I think there's a little bit of that wild eyed wonder that we sometimes lose, especially when you're building your own business. You're in the weeds so much, and you feel very kind of surrounded by the knowledge and the industry that you work in, that sometimes we forget that there's life outside of this. And I think that being able to mentor folks who are younger kind of brought that wonder and that fantasy of like what's to come and the kind of unknowingness of the future. And so, lots of different avenues to go and uncover these folks in, and I feel very fortunate that I'm kind of surrounded on all sides by people that inspire me.
Actually reminds me of a conversation that we have had with Arjun, where he talks about find your chimps, find your five chimps, the people around you that help make you a better version, as opposed to the crabs. Yeah, he told a story about crabs in a bucket. If one tries to get out, the other crabs will try and pull it down. Whereas with chimps, usually the behavior of one chimp in a small group means the others behave in a similar way. So if you surround yourself with the chimps that are mentees, mentors, people that are further down the line from you or on the same path as you, wherever they are in that journey, then you're picking the chimps that are best placed to support you. So I kind of like that crossover there. I'm going to pivot entirely. I wanted to ask you what you think in the world of chiefs of staff. How do you see that changing over the next few years, especially with technology and AI?
That's such a great question. I think that AI is not going to replace a chief of staff, but a chief of staff who knows how to use AI will replace a chief of staff, right? And I think that holds true for many different careers and professions as well. It's not just chief of staff related, but the product manager who's utilizing AI or the copywriter who's utilizing AI is going to get further ahead. And so with technology, I mean, with any technology, you're going to have to adapt and change, and hopefully it's empowering you to be more efficient. With a chief of staff specifically, I think chiefs of staff are actually the best suited to shepherd in this AI transformation, because they have context of the overall business, and they also have the bandwidth to influence different organizational members, heads of department, etc., to roll out this change. And so with technology, I don't think, and I know we're talking specifically about AI right now, I don't think the chief of staff role is going to go away anytime soon. If anything, you're going to start to look for more chiefs of staff with change management backgrounds, where they have experience bringing in new technologies, digital transformation, and knowing how to do that effectively and with the buy-in of as many people as possible. I think people are afraid of what they don't know. With AI, there's a lot of recording out there. People are afraid afraid that, okay, if I put this AI software on my computer, is it going to report everything back to the CEO? There's lots of security and privacy implications, right, when you roll something like this out. And so I think the best chiefs of staff are going to be the ones who are thinking about this, if they've not already thought about, how am I going to introduce AI into my organization in a way that is safe and trustworthy by the rest of our org so that we can continue to push forward. I don't think there's any company now who's not considering the implications of AI. And if you have a chief of staff, this is a great person to help you shepherd in this cause.
I've got some rapid fire questions for you, Clara. What's the biggest myth around startup culture?
This probably ties into what I've talked about with burnout and hustle culture, right? That the only way for your startup to succeed is if you are working more than 40 hours a week. I think that there is this kind of startup grind mentality, and I would love to steer people away from that. There are ways to have a successful business without burning the candle at both ends.
Yeah, I agree with that. Becky and I are like opposite ends of that, and she keeps reminding me that it's better her way. Um, your best productivity hack?
Time blocking. That is the biggest productivity hack I could ever impart on anybody. And time blocking does not mean that you have to fill every single minute of your calendar with doing something. Not doing something is also needs to be time blocked. Taking a walk, having lunch, sleeping, all of those things also need to be time blocked. But time blocking has been my savior when it comes to formatting my workday into something that feels productive and effective.
Most valuable app or tool you couldn't live without?
I feel like this may be a cop out answer, but I would say my phone. I use my notes app all the time just to throw all of my thoughts into it. I will leave myself voice memos about stuff as well. So maybe specifically the notes app, which is I would never show anybody because it literally looks just like a crazy person, just like stream of consciousness on that app. But it really is super helpful for me. And if I can, I also bring a physical notebook, like a small one, around with me. Mine's actually right here behind me, that I will just, again, jot down, brain dump stuff into, and then revisit at a different time. Sometimes a lot of those things get crossed off. Like that was a strange idea that I just had to write down, but it's, I think, always better to get it out than try to keep it in your head.
You never know where those things will lead, even if you don't use them as intended as well. And there is something different about like the kind of convenience of being able to capture it quickly in your phone versus something magical about pen and paper, just like going through the process of writing it down as well. So great advice or points there. One leadership skill every executive should master.
I would say for this one, knowing how you receive feedback. I think many executives say that they are good or they want feedback, but actually how it's delivered to you really matters. So I'll give myself as an example, and it took me many, many years to figure this out, but I realized that I appreciate feedback most when it's written out to me. And so that's something that I put in my user manual whenever I work with anybody, is that, hey, I do want feedback. I think it's absolutely important to get it, especially now that I run my own business, to get feedback so I can become better. But what I ask is that you write it out for me. And the reason is because I know that I'm an emotional person. Like when I see something or, observe something or react to something, like I have a very visceral reaction and emotion to start. And then I need to give myself distance from feeling the feeling and then processing it. So when people give me feedback and they write it out, the first time I read it, I can just have all the reactions, right? Which is usually defense. Like, I'm like, no, I don't do that. Or like, it's because, situation, context, blame, deflect, all of these things that we as humans do because we don't like to be wrong.
Yeah, I relate.
Then I'll give myself, a little bit of time and then reread it to then, read it for the context of what it is, which is constructive feedback. And then the last piece for that is that I want to repeat it back to the person who gave it to me in my own words to really make sure, it's similar to when you teach something to someone, you crystallize it. I think when you're able to verbalize it back to someone, then you have truly internalized whatever it is that someone is trying to tell you, right? And if I verbalize it back and they're like, you missed the point of what I was trying to tell you, then like let's go through the process again, right? Like let's try it again. But I think that learning how you take feedback is such a critical part of the self-awareness journey that an entrepreneur or any leader needs to go through, because if you don't know how it's best for you to receive the feedback, then you can't, it doesn't matter how much feedback you get, you're never going to internalize it.
Great points. Well, thank you for speaking with us today. It's fascinating getting a peek into your career and learning. I can tell you've got your eyes wide open in business, and it's really helpful for the audience and ourselves as well to receive some of your insights. Where can people follow you, connect with you, and watch what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It was so great to talk about my entrepreneur journey, which is still, I still say it's like a burgeoning journey. I'm still learning a lot every day. People can connect with me on LinkedIn, Clara Ma, and also check out our website, askachiefofstaff.com. It's where we post everything that we are doing. We have in person events, we have recruiting services. So, for many of your listeners who might be considering hiring on a chief of staff, get in touch with us. We can tell you what to look for, help you find the right candidates, and hopefully find you a perfect chief of staff to help you run your business and get to the next level.
Sounds good. We'll put those in the show notes. Thank you, Clara.
Thank you, Clara.
All right, have a good one. Bye, everyone.